I stood in front of that gleaming camera, my heartbeat thudding in my chest so loudly that I could hear it over the buzz of the studio lights. My name is Julia, and at 37 years old, I am a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps. It felt surreal to be standing there, my military uniform crisp and sharp, contrasting with the casual attire of the other guests who talked easily of their 9-to-5 jobs. I could feel my father's proud gaze on me from the audience, but his earlier words echoed in my mind like a taunt. Just a security guard, he had told his friends, as if my role was anything but monumental. My hands were clenched into fists at my sides, fighting the urge to shake off the doubt creeping in. The lights dimmed, and the host smiled brightly, gesturing toward me. And now, we welcome Captain Julia, an inspiring figure in our military who is here to share her experiences. The applause echoed, but all I could focus on was the weight of every eye in the room. I had fought tooth and nail to break out of the stereotype of my father's dismissive remark, but even now, standing on a platform where my service would be celebrated, I wrestled with the fear that I was still defined by those words. My breath hitched, a tightness settling in my chest, and for a moment, I questioned whether I truly belonged in the spotlight. I launched into the story of my last deployment, the dust churning around us like a war zone manifesto, every night a reminder of the mission we had undertaken. As I spoke about the camaraderie and the bravery of my fellow Marines, I could see the interest in their eyes begin to shift. This was not just a story about a woman in uniform, it was a testament to resilience, about breaking barriers that had been built for decades. I had trained hard, sacrificed weekends, relationships, and even my own sense of self to get to this moment, yet a small part of me feared that my father's take on my life would linger like a shadow. But then, through the haze of nerves, I saw a young woman in the crowd, tears glistening in her eyes. I realized that my story was resonating with someone. Perhaps it was a reflection of all those who felt overlooked, labeled unfairly, or forced into boxes they didn't belong in. My chest loosened, and I inhaled deeply, drawing strength from the very essence of what I had fought for, not just my position as a captain, but the recognition that women like me were powerful and worthy of every accolade. I could feel my father's perception of me shifting, reshaping into something that resembled pride instead of condescension. When the segment ended, the applause thundered again, a balm for my racing heart. I stepped down from the platform, the thrill of having spoken my truth intertwined with the anxiety of what would come next. As I greeted the guests who approached for a conversation, I felt lighter, an echo of laughter and acceptance washing over me. Perhaps I had stepped off the label of just a security guard and into something more, a voice, a leader, and a symbol of change. This was not only about me, it was about every woman who faced the same doubts. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the untold stories of military women, courage, sacrifice, and truth. Your support helps more voices like mine be heard. It's strange how quickly an ordinary day can morph into something you never anticipated. I stood behind the podium at the base auditorium, glancing at the rows of familiar faces. The military is a tight-knit world, and even though I wore my uniform with pride, the weight of the moment pressed down on me. I could hear my father's laughter ringing in my head, his offhand comments about my career always tinged with a hint of embarrassment. Just a security guard, he would say to guests, always downplaying what I had fought so hard to achieve. I knew it was a joke, a harmless jab, but now, as I prepared to begin my speech, those words echoed unsettlingly. The Marines taught me to be composed, to maintain a cool exterior in the face of chaos, but all that training felt like flimsy armor against the vulnerability swelling within me. I could sense my heartbeat drum louder with each passing second, reverberating through my chest like a siren in the night. Today was not just another assignment, it was a culmination of years of sacrifice, training, and resilience. My colleagues nodded at me, their expressions encouraging, but I couldn't shake the nervous energy coursing through my veins. I was about to address a live audience, broadcasting my words beyond this auditorium, and in a way, I was stepping into my father's world, the world of exposure and judgment. When I finally began to speak, the room fell silent, each person hanging on to my every word. I shared stories from my time in the field, the privilege of serving alongside some of the bravest individuals I'd ever known. I felt tears prick my eyes as I recounted moments of triumph and loss, experiences that defined more than just a career for me. They shaped who I was, embodying resilience in a way few ever understood. This isn't just about the uniform, I said, my voice steadying as I continued. It's about the people, the connections we forge, and the sacrifices that bind us together. I could see my fellow Marines nodding in acknowledgement, a collective memory weaving between us. Yet in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if this speech would change how my father saw me. The joke, while it made me cringe, revealed his discomfort with my choices. If he could see me now, perhaps he'd understand that I was no longer just a daughter. I was a leader, a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, not simply fighting for my country but also for the respect that came with that title. My father's laughter had once felt like a protective shield, a way to soften the harsh realities of my profession, but today I stood determined to shatter that image. I needed him to know how deeply this role mattered to me, how intertwined military life was with my identity. As the final applause echoed around me, I felt an unexpected rush of warmth surround me, not just from my fellow Marines but from the realization that I was no longer bound by anyone's perception of my worth. I had embraced my truth, defying the narrative my father had woven. I had come to understand my own strength and resilience beyond the confines of a label. Turning to leave the stage, I caught my reflection in the glass behind me. For the first time in a long time, I recognized the fierce woman staring back, no longer just a daughter, and certainly not just a security guard, but a captain who commanded respect, both from herself and others. It was one of those muggy summer afternoons when the air feels thicker than molasses. I was sitting in the break room at the station, scrolling through headlines on my phone, when a notification popped up that made my heart skip, an article about an upcoming military ceremony honoring veterans' contributions, and there, clear as day, was the face of a young woman who looked like a reflection of my past. I froze, the coffee cup I had brought to my lips trembling slightly as memories spiraled back, vivid and harsh. The girl in the photograph was barely out of her teens, yet the pride in her stance echoed the same spirit I'd felt all those years ago when I first earned my stripes. That first mission, the one that had changed everything, seemed both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. I was a second lieutenant, eager to prove myself, full of ambition and adrenaline. Arriving in a foreign land, I had been greeted not by the flowers and flags of parades but by the tension in the air, thick and foreboding, a reminder that I was now part of something much larger than myself. The memory of the first time I wore that uniform haunted me, the weight of the fabric against my skin, the sun glistening off the brass of my insignia, and the feeling of my father's eyes on me. He had beamed with pride, but also, in that moment, I sensed an inkling of what it meant to stand under such scrutiny, not just as a service member, but as a woman in a man's world. When I got home that evening, my family had gathered for dinner. My dad, a security guard at a local mall, always downplayed his job around guests. "Just a security guard," he would say with a chuckle, shrugging off the importance of his work while he made sure the doors were locked and the exits monitored. But as I sat at the table across from him, I could see the flicker of pride in his eyes when he spoke about me, a captain in a Marine Corps uniform. For him, my role was a badge of honor, a reality check that shone brighter than any mundane job. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath that pride lay an unspoken fear, that my own path held risks he could hardly fathom. After the meal, I retreated to my room, the walls adorned with photographs from deployments and memories. There was one in particular that always caught my breath, a candid shot of me on a live video feed, addressing the nation about our efforts overseas. I remembered the rush of adrenaline mixed with anxiety, knowing that my words would resonate in homes across the country. But beyond the surface of that image lay the weight of the sacrifices made, friendships lost, and the fragility of our existence in a time of conflict. It was exhilarating and terrifying, and I often wondered if my dad ever understood that the captains on the battlefield carried their stories in places that weren't captured on camera. Now, years later, I found myself sitting alone in that break room, grappling with the duality of my identity. The pride I felt, intermixed with moments of doubt, reminded me that this journey wouldn't just be about recognition as a captain or the roles we played within our families. It was a struggle for understanding, not just from others but from myself. The girl in the photo reflected not just a soldier, but a daughter, a woman fighting to carve her place in a world that had underestimated her for too long. And while I could still hear my father's voice in the back of my mind, dismissing his own worth, I vowed that I would not let his doubts diminish the journey that had shaped me into who I was today. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor of our living room, the early afternoon sun spilling through the window and casting stripes of light across the carpet. My dad had just finished another of his long shifts as a security guard, his blue jacket still slightly wrinkled from the early morning rush. As he slumped onto the couch, tiredness etched into every line of his face, I could almost see the weight of his world pressing down on him. His job was the constant joke in our family, a punchline in the middle of dinner conversations, always followed by a chuckle from my older brothers. Someone would say his title with a mock seriousness, and I'd laugh along, even as a part of me wished for something more, something nobler. Just a security guard, he'd say to his friends with a shrug, the words carrying a tone of apology. But that wasn't all he was, at least not to me. He was present at all my soccer games, cheering louder than anyone else, his booming voice cutting through the crowd. He wrapped me in his arms after every win and loss, reassuring me that my efforts were what mattered most. The duality of his life struck me as I grew older. I began to understand that behind those tired eyes was a man who had dreams once, dreams of service, of making a difference, but life had steered him into the hard truth of working-class survival. It was during our dinner a week before I left for boot camp that the silence fell heavily over the table. My mother was fussing over my brothers, and Dad sat there, his fork poised mid-air, the smirk fading from his face. "You're sure you want to do this, Jules?" The question lingered, the weight of it hanging between us like a thick fog. I wanted to tell him that I felt a calling. The idea of serving my country filled me with purpose, but doubts flickered across his expression, shadows of worry and fear. Those unfounded fears did little to shake my resolve. I wanted to break the cycle, to redefine the essence of who we were as a family. As I embarked on my journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving part of myself behind. Each drill and exercise molded me into someone different, someone more than the little girl perched on the living room floor, but every accomplishment felt like a tug at my roots. The pride I felt as I ascended through the ranks was marred by the memories of Dad's hesitant smile. I could sense the silent burden he carried, thinking perhaps his own dreams had turned into those of his daughter, and was that too much to bear? It was as if breaking away from the familiar had come at a cost to our bond. When the day finally arrived for my deployment, Dad stood by the door, his back against the frame, shoulders slumped but head held high. I could see the tightness in his jaw as he watched me, a mixture of pride and fear swirling in his eyes. With a deep breath, I offered him a reassuring smile, but it felt laced with guilt. I was stepping into uncharted waters, becoming part of something larger than both of us, and I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps the weight of my decisions would only serve to deepen the divide. I wanted to make him proud. I wanted to show him that his sacrifices mattered, that every uncelebrated day he spent working to provide for us wasn't in vain. Every time I donned my uniform and took on the mantle of leadership, I felt the echoes of our past reverberate within me. My journey was intertwined with the hopes and struggles of a father who had forged his path through struggle. When I found my image on the screen, a representative of the very ideals he aspired to touch, I hoped it would bridge the chasm between us, that I could finally make him see who I had become and perhaps be the one to lift his spirit, not just as his daughter but as a reflection of his unrelenting spirit. When I first decided to join the military, I knew the road ahead would be steep, fraught with challenges that would test not just my physical abilities, but my very identity. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my father across from me. I could see his worry etched into the lines of his face, the way his fingers tapped nervously against the wood. "Are you sure, Julia?" he'd asked, almost as if he were trying to find a way to say that he didn't want me to leave the nest, though I could sense that it was more than that. There was an unspoken belief that a girl should tread carefully, that ambition might sometimes be a burden heavier than one could bear. But I couldn't ignore the burning desire to prove my worth, not just to him, but to myself. The first few months of training were brutal. I remember my lungs burning with each breath as I pushed through drills at dawn, the air thick with the weight of expectation. Every day, I was surrounded by a sea of faces, each one either just as determined or more so than I was. I often found myself questioning whether I truly belonged among them. The moments of doubt crept in during the quiet times, like when I would lie in my bunk, replaying the moments when my father introduced me to guests as just a security guard. It stung to hear him diminish my aspirations, even if it wasn't intentional. I knew I had to show everyone, that I was more than that. I was capable of so much more. A turning point came during a field exercise that involved navigation and strategy. I remember leading my squad into a simulated combat scenario, my heart racing as I crouched low, trying to gauge the best approach. I felt the weight of my rank pressing down on my shoulders, but in that moment, it molded into something like a shield. My voice rang out across the forest as I directed my team, the adrenaline coursing through me. The satisfaction that came from our success was intoxicating. I could feel the respect shift from apprehension to acknowledgement, and it sparked something deep within me. I couldn't help but think about how important it was to finally shed the label that had haunted me for so long. Yet, the moment of validation I craved didn't come until much later, during a live training broadcast designed for potential recruits. The cameras were rolling, and even though it felt surreal, I embraced it. I stood tall, knowing that I was not just fighting for myself but for every girl like me who had ever faced skepticism. As I spoke about resilience and teamwork, I could see the expressions of my fellow Marines shift from mere camaraderie to genuine pride. It was a small moment, but one that reverberated through the years. When my father watched it unfold on screen, I could feel the shift in his perception, the way he began to see the strength I carried, not just as a Marine, but as his daughter. Now, years later, I often reflect on those early days and the journey I undertook. My father's initial reservations have transformed into unwavering support, and I can tell he carries a hint of pride when he tells others about my service. It's not just about the rank or the uniform, it's about the life I've carved out for myself. Every challenge faced and every obstacle overcome has been a testament to my resolve. I no longer seek validation from others. I've found it within myself, and that knowledge is what drives me forward. I understand now that proving worth is not just a singular event but a continuous journey, one that I will navigate with the same tenacity that brought me here in the first place. I remember the day vividly. It was one of those rare sunny mornings that felt almost too perfect to be real. I had just returned from a long deployment, my gear still slightly dusty, but the thought of home filled me with warmth. I walked through the door and embraced my dad, the strong arms of a man who had always been my rock. He grinned his usual crooked smile but, instead of asking about my missions or my service, he simply said, "Just a security guard, huh?" I could see the well-meaning jest in his eyes, but it stung more than I cared to admit. Those words hung heavy in the air, weighing down a moment that should have been filled with joy. As I settled back into civilian life, I fought against that casual dismissal. I had earned my rank through sweat and sacrifice. I had trained harder than I ever thought possible. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father's words echoed in the back of my mind. Each time I stepped out in my crisp uniform, I felt the weight of expectations resting on my shoulders. I wasn't just a soldier, I was a leader, a captain. I had navigated through battles, internal and external, but somehow, the most challenging confrontation lay ahead, the judgment of those I loved most. The turning point came unexpectedly when a local news station featured a segment on women in the military. I was notified only hours before it aired that they'd be highlighting my story. My initial response was panic. I dreaded the thought of being someone's punchline. But as I prepared to go live, a spark ignited within me. I realized this was my opportunity to redefine what it meant to serve, to show my father and the world that I was more than a joke or a stereotype. I rehearsed my lines over and over, fortifying myself with every breath I took. When the camera rolled, I was nervous but determined. I spoke about my journey, the late nights of training, and the camaraderie of my fellow Marines. For the first time, I didn't just list my accomplishments, I shared how each moment shaped me and made me resilient. I explained the sacrifices my comrades made and the weight of our responsibilities. As the segment aired, I felt the energy shift. This was no longer just a story about me, it was a testament to the countless women who serve and sacrifice in silence. I could feel the air pulse with each word, each thought, as if the very fabric of my experience was being woven into the lives of those watching. That evening, as we gathered around the television, I saw my dad's expression change. I watched as the corners of his mouth lifted into an understanding smile, his eyes glistening with unspoken pride. The moment lingered in the air, filled with both newfound respect and love. I realized then that overcoming obstacles isn't merely about proving others wrong but about finding approval in one's own voice. I had faced that insecurity and transformed it into an opportunity to inspire, not just myself, but my father and anyone who might doubt a woman in uniform. As I glanced at him, I felt a sense of triumph that resonated deeper than any rank could offer. I remember the first time I stood in the doorway of our family home, the air heavy with a mix of summer heat and anticipation. Dad had invited some friends over for a barbecue, and I could tell he was proud to show off his family. But when they asked what I was doing, I could hear it in his voice. "Oh, she's just a security guard." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. There was a slip in his tone, a small twist that made it clear he wished to downplay my role. That moment stung. I understood that he meant no harm, yet all I could feel was a rush of determination. The thought of being just anything ignited a fire beneath my skin. I spent years proving to myself what I could accomplish, pushing through each hardship like a soldier in a battleground. It wasn't always easy. I faced the skepticism of others while navigating the demands of my job and security. There were nights I questioned if I had made the right choices, but every time I allowed doubt to creep in, I remembered the dreams I had nurtured for so long. I trained harder, mentally and physically, pushing through exhaustion and self-doubt. I wasn't ready to be just a footnote in anyone's story, least of all my own. Then came the day I received the call that would change everything. I was standing in the training room, sweat dripping down my back, when the recruiter from the Marines informed me they had an opening. I felt my heart race with excitement and fear. Joining the Marine Corps felt like the culmination of persistence, like I was finally claiming my place in the world. My family's reactions were mixed, some were proud, while others echoed Dad's dismissive undertones. I stood firm, resolved to forge my own path regardless of their expectations. My journey since then has been exhilarating, filled with triumphs and challenges that have shaped me into who I am today. I can still hear the doubts and whispered criticisms echoing in my mind, but they only fuel my resolve. I've led operations, trained fellow Marines, and faced adversities that would make a lesser soldier falter. Each experience has layered resilience and growth, with moments that have tested my limits and shown me the depth of my own strength. It's an endeavor that redefines how I see myself, transitioning from just a guard to a leader with a purpose. When my family finally saw me on live TV, accepting an award for my dedication, their faces illuminated something I had longed for: understanding. I wasn't just anything, I was a captain, a Marine, someone who had broken barriers through persistence and hard work. The pride in their eyes didn't erase the past but knitted together a new narrative, one where I was no longer hidden in the shadows of doubt. I smiled as the cameras flashed, knowing that I had fought fiercely for this moment. And in that instant, standing tall in my uniform, I felt the weight of all those years finally lift, replaced by a sense of belonging that had eluded me for so long. I remember the day vividly. It was a quiet afternoon in early May. The sky was a somber gray, reflecting the uncertainty that had settled over me since the day I received the call. As a captain in the Marine Corps, I was no stranger to loss, but nothing could prepare me for the death of my younger brother, Matt. He had always looked up to me, the girl with the eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo, ready to conquer the world, while he pursued his dreams at home. The news felt surreal, like a cruel joke, but it was too heavy to be anything but true. I had rushed home, only to find my family engulfed in grief, each of us locked in our own battle against the crushing weight of absence. At the funeral, I stood rigid and composed, a facade honed from years of training. The uniform felt like armor, but I still couldn't shake the pit in my stomach. I scanned the crowd, finding faces both familiar and foreign, glancing at my father as he greeted guests who had come to pay their respects. He introduced me with a shrug, calling me just a security guard, as if my rank hadn't defined the woman I had become. I wanted to scream, to tell them all how much more I was, not just in title but in spirit, and how much more Matt had been, too. They needed to know he was more than a quiet kid with a penchant for photography. He was the one who reminded me of home when I was away, who'd text me jokes late at night, ensuring I wouldn't forget my laughter amidst the chaos. As the service began, I felt each sob punctuate the air, each one a reminder of the void Matt left behind. My heart ached for my sister, who clutched a framed photo of him, her eyes brimming with tears. I could feel the anger rising within me, directed at the universe for robbing us of someone so vital. I wanted to be strong for them, to lock away my own grief so I could support my family. But in that moment, it felt impossible to separate my own pain from theirs. I was the captain, a leader expected to steer us through the storm. Yet, in the eye of that hurricane, I felt utterly lost. That evening, after the last of the guests had left and the house fell into a heavy silence, I found myself at Matt's old room. The walls were adorned with his photography, snapshots of life frozen in time. I felt an overwhelming wave of nostalgia crash over me, and suddenly the armor I had built around my emotions felt too suffocating. I sank to the floor, surrounded by his presence, the laughter and warmth I could never reclaim. I wanted to hold on to every memory, but they were slipping through my fingers. I thought about how he would have laughed to see me on live television, leading troops, making decisions that could change lives, yet here I was, feeling utterly powerless against the loss of my brother. In the days that followed, I knew I had to channel my grief into something meaningful. I took a deep breath and called a local charity that worked with veterans struggling with loss. If Matt taught me anything, it was to honor the people we loved by living fully, by making every sacrifice worthwhile. I realized I didn't want to be just a security guard in my father's eyes or my own. I wanted to embody the tenacity and resilience Matt admired. The Marines had given me purpose and direction, so I would carry both my duty and my brother's memory forward as I continued to serve, because that was how I would keep Matt alive. The day I got my promotion to captain was one of those rare moments when the world around you fades, and all that matters is the weight of the insignia that's just been pinned onto your uniform. It's a small, almost mundane gesture, but the pride that surged through me felt like an electric current, connecting me not only to my squad but to every woman who had fought to break through glass ceilings before me. I recall standing there, the hot sun bearing down on us during the ceremony, hearing my father's familiar chuckles as he recalled how he always introduced himself as just a security guard while I introduced myself with a decisive "I am Captain Julia." For him, my title somehow felt bold, yet inconsequential. But, standing there in front of my peers, I finally grasped the significance of those words. That recognition intensified during our last deployment when I led my team through a particularly tough mission. Each decision had weighed heavily on my shoulders, and I had felt the burden of responsibility that came with my rank. But when it was all over, the praise from my peers was different. It was laced with camaraderie and mutual respect. They came to me, one by one, sharing their thoughts on how my leadership had shaped our success. It was more than just a pat on the back, it was a validation of years of resilience. Each word felt like a brick, building up a fortress around my confidence that had sometimes felt so fragile. Yet, as I stood there absorbing the praise, I couldn't help but steal glances at my father, who had made the trip to watch me in action. His eyes sparkled with unshed tears. He was a man who rarely showed such vulnerability, yet in that moment, I could see pride radiating from him. I realized he would never fully grasp the intricacies of my role, the calculations and decisions that sculpted my journey, but he believed in me wholeheartedly. That was enough. I silently vowed to be the captain who would make not just him, but everyone else who had supported me throughout my life, proud. Still, the lingering thought of being labeled just a security guard by my dad occasionally crept in, especially during quieter moments when I would reflect on my path. I had worked hard to earn my place, to dismantle that label threaded through our lives. Yet, as I looked at my fellow Marines, their expressions filled with respect and recognition, I began to understand that titles may just be words. What truly mattered was the bond we shared as a unit, the trust built on shared experiences and hardships. Together, we had crafted a narrative that transcended the constraints of our individual identities, creating something larger than ourselves. I was not just a captain, not just Julia, but a part of something infinitely more significant. The day I took off my uniform and opted for civvies was like stepping into a different world. I remember peeling off the crisp, tailored fabric that had become my second skin. The day was warm, and that small act felt like shedding a weight I had carried for far too long. But as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting a black tank top and worn jeans, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still very much wrapped in my military identity. My father had made a point, and while I appreciated his words, I felt the urge to show him that I was more than just a daughter who had taken a path vastly different from what he envisioned for me. When we went to that party at my parents' place, I was met with curious glances and polite smiles from family friends. They couldn't quite reconcile the young girl they knew with the woman who had returned home on leave, wearing a military dog tag like it was a badge of honor, or shame, depending on who you asked. My dad introduced me with the usual line about being a security guard, a white lie that felt more like a snare. Each time he said it, something twisted in my stomach. I wanted to correct him, to assert my identity as a captain in the Marine Corps, a leader of men and women who believed in something greater. But the anxiety of confronting my father in front of a room full of familiar faces held me back. It was just a few hours into the evening when I found myself face to face with an old family friend, a man who had been a father figure to me when my own dad was wrapped up in work. He looked at me with a mix of pride and pity, the kind that made me want to flinch. "You're still serving, huh? Doing your dad proud?" he asked, and even though the words were intended as a compliment, I felt the sting of expectation. I took a breath, gathering my thoughts. This was my moment, the moment to stand up for who I truly was, not just for myself but for every woman who had ever felt diminished by someone else's viewpoint. "Actually, I'm a captain," I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. My dad's eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. I could see in that moment the conflict within him, pride battling against the fears and beliefs he had nurtured since my childhood. But I stood firm, holding on to my truth, looking around the room at faces that ranged from shock to disbelief. Some people shifted uncomfortably, while others seemed to lean in, suddenly interested in the conversation that had just veered into uncharted waters. As I continued to speak, I shared stories about my time in training, the challenges and the camaraderie that I cultivated amongst my fellow Marines. I could feel the atmosphere shift, not entirely unfriendly, but charged with a tension that had been simmering beneath the surface. My father eventually joined me, finding his voice to chime in about deployments and achievements. I was surprised by how quickly the conversation morphed, moving from my identity as just a security guard to something that resonated more deeply. It wasn't just about me asserting my role, it was about redefining what it meant to serve, to be proud, and to honor those sacrifices we all make, in one form or another. My father had always been proud of his service in the Navy, a proud heritage that he imbued in me from childhood. The first time I donned a uniform, I remember his stern expression softening as I hugged him tightly. Yet, through every deployment, every medal earned, there lay an invisible barrier between us, one I thought I could break down with hard work and honor. But that night, when I stood on live television, the distant wariness in his eyes morphed into shock. I could almost hear his thoughts echoing, just a security guard. For a moment, I feared I had let him down. Instead, I found myself on display, a Marine captain exposing the grit and sacrifices behind my uniform, something he had never truly grasped. Watching the guests' mixed expressions on his face was surreal. They'd come to celebrate, to commend him for being the father of the security guard, a title I knew weighed heavily on him. But in that instant, with the cameras flashing and the applause ringing out, I felt as if I was wrestling with some internal demon. How would they adjust their perceptions now? I had been labeled an other, a role he never envisioned for me. To him, I was not just a daughter in uniform, I was a vessel of expectations and legacy, and somehow, in his eyes, I had ventured too far from the path he had laid out. The pride I thought he'd feel was mingled with an unmistakable tension that hung palpably in the air. Yet, as the segment progressed, I saw his demeanor shift. The astonishment subsided, replaced by a hint of realization. I could only hope he was starting to see that my experience wasn't just a job. It was about resilience, dedication, and a commitment that transcended the titles we assigned each other. My voice, steady and strong as I recounted my struggles and triumphs, was a testament to all that I had endured. I could sense the audience's change, too. Those who once regarded me as merely a background character in my father's narrative were now leaning forward, listening intently. I was more than a security guard. I was a representative of strength, a symbol of the diverse paths our lives can take in service to our country. The applause that followed my segment washed over me like a tidal wave of affirmation. I glanced back at my father, whose expression was now a mix of admiration and something akin to regret, perhaps for underestimating what my military career had meant to me. I felt a surge of optimism. Maybe this was a turning point for us. Maybe his understanding would finally bridge the gap that had felt insurmountable for so long. As I walked off the stage and made my way back to him, my heart raced with the thought of how this moment could reshape our relationship. No longer would I be just his daughter. I was a captain in the Marine Corps, with battles and victories of my own. That night, as we sat in the living room, silence hung heavy between us. The glow of the television flickered reminders of my appearance, but rather than continuing to replay that moment, I turned to him. "Dad, I hope you understand that being in this uniform means something more to me than just a job. It's my life." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady on mine, and for the first time, I felt a shared understanding take root. Together, we had crossed a threshold that had kept us apart for years. I may have walked into that studio as just a security guard in his eyes, but I left it as more than just his daughter. I left it as a woman who carved her own identity in a world often defined by titles. As I sit here in my combat boots, the weight of countless moments washes over me. Each scuffed toe and worn-down heel carries a story, stories of grit, comradeship, and personal victories that I once feared I would never achieve. There was a time when I craved the approval of those who dismissed my aspirations as mere fantasies. I can still hear my dad's words echoing in my mind, "Just a security guard," he said, as if that was all I could ever be. But now, standing tall as a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, I no longer seek validation from those who once sidelined me. I am no longer defined by their limited vision of my potential. The night my face lit up the screens on that live TV broadcast was a turning point not just for me, but for all the naysayers who had doubted my ambitions. They saw me in my dress blues, my shoulders squared, and my resolve as solid as the badge I proudly wore. I was no longer just the child of a man who labeled me. I was a leader, a protector, and a representative of countless women who were learning to stand up against the tide of underestimation. As I spoke to the cameras, I felt the weight of my father's expectations fall away, replaced with the realization that my journey was mine alone to carve out. I remember glancing at the audience, their faces a mix of shock and admiration, some even a little sheepish. A part of me relished in this newfound recognition, but the other part, the part that found strength in silence, reminded me that this was not just a moment of personal triumph. It was a shift in the narrative for every young girl who looked in the mirror and felt less than. I had become a symbol, a reminder that labels are merely constructs and that we have the power to reshape our destinies. The validation I once sought now felt like a heavy cloak I was ready to shed. Life in the Corps has taught me that the battle is not just fought on foreign soil, but often right here at home, within our minds. Embracing vulnerability, admitting when we feel small, is what makes us strong. each day I lace up my boots and step onto the base, I'm reminded of the little girl who wanted to fly but was told her dreams were too lofty. I now know that it's okay to want more, to push against the constraints set by others, and to turn those constraints into fuel for our ascent. Every challenge I faced only brought me closer to who I was meant to be, someone who leads with empathy and courage. So here I am, a captain, but more importantly, a woman who has rewritten the story once told by those who tried to keep me small. I embrace the journey ahead with unwavering determination, ready to take on whatever comes my way. As I close this chapter, I find solace in the knowledge that I am no longer defined by the limitations of others. I am the architect of my own future, one built upon resilience, strength, and the unwavering belief that we can rise beyond our labels, just like the phoenix that breaks free from its ashes, soaring into the boundless sky. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from.